The meat for the lions, or
Hey, so we're on there now. Hey, everyone. I am so excited that I've got this amazing panel of experts, and we're going to be talking about AI and cybersecurity. And I don't know if you want to do we can do like a quick little, introductions. I'm Deborah Baker. I'm president of Trusted CISO and also Trusted AI Solutions. And Rupa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. Really excited for this conversation today. I'm Rupa, I head up security and IT here at Handshake, which is a career services platform for new grads or undergrad students to find their dream jobs and employers to find the right candidates, no matter where they are from, what university they go to, parental background, and so on and so forth. So really excited to be here. My career started off working on privacy preserving data mining technology way back, like 2 decades back, when it was still greenfield. So really exciting. It's like the whole thing. It's like old wine in new bottle. It's a new face, and like at the end of the day, the root problem is the same. So really excited about the conversation today.
Awesome. Mike, you want to go and introduce yourself?
I'm the CTO at Trusted AI Solutions, and got about a 45-year background in developing, designing, and implementing AI solutions for everything from government to commercial to private ventures and so forth. My love in life is doing investment analysis or quant analysis using AI. And I also have a second love, which is cybersecurity and applying AI to that as well. Glad to meet you all.
Okay, Allison.
Hey everyone, I'm Allison Miller. I'm a cybersecurity and technology exec, and my specialty, I tend to focus on applying techniques like behavioral analytics to protecting social and economic systems. So in addition to cybersecurity, I have a deep background in payment fraud, in anti-abuse technology, and I have applied those techniques at places like Visa, PayPal, eBay, Skype, Electronic Arts, Google, and most recent Bank of America, and most recently Reddit.
Wow.
Awesome. And Steve?
Hi, I'm the Chief Product Officer at Contrast Security. Contrast is a company that works primarily with Global 2000 organizations, and they use our products to ensure the security of their code, that they're building applications without vulnerable points in them. But more relevant to this, I've also been working with an open source group called OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Project Foundation, if you're not familiar. Which is a 20-year-old well-known foundation dedicated to application security. And in particular, I'm leading a new project, which is the creation of the top 10 list of security vulnerabilities for large language models.
That is so awesome. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so first question. How is AI transforming the cybersecurity landscape, and what are some real-world examples of its application in threat detection and response? And who wants to take it?
I'll take it. I'll kind of go first because I feel like the role of machine learning and behavioral analytics, it's been a slow burn, right? It's been probably 10 years since every product on the Black Hat or RSA show floor started having little like ML inside stickers on them, right? It's been an important technique to allow folks to be able to automate detection that would otherwise require human expertise to go in and triage. And given how big the systems have gotten that we're defending, it's absolutely critical that we're able to introduce automation. So what we're seeing more recently with the introduction of LLMs and such is just a lot of excitement around how can we amplify or turbocharge what analysts are doing by giving them, instead of having to maybe structure or understand how to put together complex queries, to put together rule sets and automate playbooks. maybe they can just ask a really smart model a question and it will spit out the code, or it will help them figure out how to automate using natural language instead of a syntax. And I'm really excited with what I have seen as far as how analysts are kind of jumping on this and adding it to their toolkit. So not necessarily relying on it, but just experimenting with it and adding it into the mix.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. When you look back over the history of it since, maybe 2016, 2017, when these open source toolkits like TensorFlow and PyTorch came out, a lot more organizations were able to add predictive AI models to what they were doing in a way where they didn't have to go hire academic research experts in the AI field to get some of the benefits of AI. And you saw that coming into things like user behavior analytics, data loss prevention, where they were able to model things there that would take the place of human inspection that couldn't happen fast enough. And, in a previous role that I was in, we built analytics features that scored user behavior, where we built models all the way down to the level of how people typed. And if I logged into Allison's account with her password, it would probably flag me because I didn't look and feel like Allison. So that's been happening for a while. But I do agree this generative AI is quantitatively different in terms of the way people approach it, and just really thinking about there being a barrier or divide between the applicability of these traditional predictive models and these generative models and what you can do with them, and sort of the different use cases they cover. They don't really replace the predictive models. They enable a new set of use cases.
I'll add on to that over the decades of working with AI, the thing that I've noticed is the rise and fall of popularity and credibility. Essentially, it would rise. The naysayers and what I call the henny-penny news of the sky is falling, it's going to cause the extinction of mankind. They would run out immediately to validate themselves and get a couple of bucks out of the sensationalizing the news. They would knock it down, and it rises up for a bit, and then it would get knocked back down again. Well, my experience of this is that this wave is a tsunami, and it is not going to go away. I don't think it's going to be something that's going to carry all of these decades and decades of AI development forward. And there's some really wonderful ideas that go back to the 60s, like chatbots themselves go back to the 60s, and a large amount of what we classified as AI, which was really expert systems, which had a glorified fuzzification of rules, now has evolved into everybody, beating on the desk and going, well, it's all machine learning. And then when, a general AI comes out, artificial general AI comes out, then we'll say, oh, AGI is really AI. So it's fascinating to me to watch the evolution of AI as it goes forward from a historic standpoint, and then kind of try to pattern predict forward. So if we've done all this, and this is what the human tendency is, what do we have to look forward to next? And that would be a spicy question to dig into.
Right. The other thing I would add on to all of your wonderful points is the ability for small startups, or like small SOC or security operation centers, to quickly get jobs started. There's always that cold start problem in terms of where do you start? How do you know whether a vulnerability is and a threat is actually an exposure? We are getting exposed. Is it how rampant it is, how prevalent it is? Those kind of detection factors become so much easier now. Yes, it needs to be taken with a grain of salt, but you don't need a team. A user behavior analytics team to start off your SOC right now, right? You have that the whole threat intel behind you. Like, think back, Log4j, everyone here was scrambling. So with that kind of technology, then the learnings in place, if we have another the seed or the inklings of a new attack of similar vein, the assumption is that we will know sooner than later and understand those anti-patterns and be able to better react on it. I think that's the value that it brings, which then comes down to, can someone poison it? or misuse it to spread chaos around, right? But I think used correctly, I think there's a lot of potential that I can bring, especially to smaller, to smaller startups, right? Or smaller teams, security teams, small, lean security teams, to be a lot more self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the generative AI, thinking about this, it's kind of broken down the barriers to where just the average person, it's kind of like in the 90s when they realized, oh, grandma can go and say www.google.com. Because at the beginning, they were like, I'm not sure, like, my aunt's not going to figure this out. I don't really see, the internet being used for business or whatever. And that's kind of what I see with this generative AI, because now you don't have to understand all of that behind the predictive models and all that. You can just ask the question, in natural language. And so I think that's really what's, made the difference right now with AI and where we're at and everything, like you said, and that these smaller teams, because security a lot of times is an afterthought and they are understaffed, and being able to use this AI and all of this tools is really going to help them.
Mm.
So for our second question, it's what are the potential risks and ethical implications of using AI in cybersecurity, and how can these be mitigated?
So I'll jump off first. I think when we talk about risks, that's what my group has been specializing in. And this OWASP group that we put together, we announced it back in May and have been working towards the 1.0 version of this list, where we've identified sort of the top 10 things that development teams need to worry about if they're going to incorporate generative AI technology with a large language model into their software development. And we see people across industries rushing to do that. And there's a lot of really specific risks there. But in essence, if you look at the kind of security things that traditional application developers have worried about, things that have always been at the top of the list are things like injection attacks. And, if somebody's going to take SQL and put that into my username field and I didn't properly scrub it, and they say their username is select all from field social security number, they might just get all of my customers' social security numbers. But people have known how to do that or avoid that for decades, and there are straightforward steps to do it. The thing at the top of our current list is called prompt injection. And it's the idea that basically almost all of the data coming into something like a chatbot is unformatted, largely untrusted data with scary side effects. And the vulnerabilities kind of go from there, from very traditional security things that have a new spin on them when you bring in large language models, like how am I going to handle permissioning and things like that. And then at places they get to things that frankly people have looked at and said, that sounds less like traditional computer security. And sometimes that's starting to sound more like psychology. And we're talking about new classes of vulnerabilities that we're giving names, things like over-reliance and excessive agency, in terms of what are you relying on for the large language model? If it's prone to hallucinate, how much do you trust the output coming out of it for mission critical operations? And frankly, what are you giving your large language model permission to do? Does it have access to backend databases inside your firewalls and things like that? If it does, it becomes confused deputy that could become a vector to all sorts of things like SSRF and all sorts of other attacks by proxy. So I think there's a bunch of very specific technical risks that come with adopting these technologies inside of your applications. And if you don't deal with those, then you're putting your organization at a real risk of organizational damage, financial damage, reputational damage. So the risks are very real. People are very excited about the possibilities, and they should be, but people are running headlong into this and haven't necessarily thought about the implications of putting these things into production without well thought out strategies for how to handle those production challenges.
I'm coming from coming from the cybersecurity standpoint. That's a really good point, Steve. I wanted to talk about a couple of things in that. I'm coming from the cybersecurity standpoint of network topologies, network enterprises, and so forth, and vulnerability tracing, threat tracing, best practice checks, model issues within the actual architectural construction, and at the same time, the foes that we're dealing with are pushing into our backside, creating havoc because they're collecting up our personal information, and then they're utilizing that to get access and then do leapfrogging and yada, yada, yada. So the landscape for cybersecurity, in my experience, is that it has suddenly changed overnight into warp speed, where that instead of getting a week or a couple of days to figure out, how we were penetrated, how we're exfiltrating, did we exfiltrate ourselves in the process of our design? You have to deal with people that are using large language models and using other forms of AI tools, reinforced learning with deep query neural net. I mean, that's some of the juicy stuff that's popping up on my radar. And what happens is that there is a need for speed, as Tom Cruise would put it. We really need to step up our use of AI in the cybersecurity field, simply because of the attacks becoming a lot more robust and simulating a D-Day attack, essentially, where they throw everything at us to find out where our weaknesses are in the network topology. They throw everything at us to find out what our personnel is composed of. Where do we put our priorities when we go to address a particular infiltration, exfiltration? Are we fooling ourselves in the sense of we designed or we configured things wrong, and basically that configuration is looking like a hacker? So we validate the actual hack itself. So that covers a large amount of the waterfront. The other thing is the psychology of a hacker coming in and what they're doing and how do they attack and what do they gain from it. That becomes a nice dissertation study in itself, just to find out, can we get our minds wrapped around that level. Up to this point, we said, well, we have kitty hackers, Medline hackers, and we have state actors. How do they think? How do they attack? And a large amount of the language models allow us to deal with whittling that down. One thing that is not being talked about in the industry, and it should be talked about in the industry, is how to provide a sanity check to the LLM model. So you have hallucinations taking place, you have non sequiturs occurring. So where do you start in providing the sanity check, and how is the sanity check done? And there's AI tools to actually work on that. They're about 30 years old, and they've been around waiting just for this day. So there we go.
Yeah. And Mike, I think where you sort of took that with comparing the AI and ML to network topology, or maybe not comparing it, but thinking of it that way, I sort of think of it as an extension of our threat surface that is completely opaque in the sense that as we have, as we grew cautiously into cloud and IoT and all of those things that were once emerging and are now stock in trade, we tried to go slowly, and we did what we were taught to do, which is let's get telemetry, let's get visibility, let's baseline what recognizable behavior is, and then what unusual behaviors would be. And here is this brand new threat surface. It just jutted out of the side of most enterprises, and you completely cannot get telemetry on it that lets you understand what it's thinking, what's normal, and how to respond to it. So all of your comments about the attackers having this technology and how they might leverage it to turbocharge their attack design or their understanding of our environment's totally true. What I hear a lot of enterprises focusing on, though, is what do they do about this really weird thing jutting out of their threat surface? How do they capitalize on all the benefits of the technology, but not lose all of their sensitive intellectual property in the process, understand what's actually kind of coming in and going out via that farm. And that's where I really, I think a lot about the problem of over-reliance, because I come from shops where I have a very strict preference for supervised learning versus unsupervised learning. And so these LLMs are just almost shocking to me, because you cannot get your arms around them if you have sort of lost control of how that intelligence or that learning is being trained. And so that's one of the things that I think is really interesting. All of these poisoning attacks, that's an attack on purpose, but unsupervised learning is really prone to skew, and you have to be very careful in how you train it. So I think that this is an area where cyber folks in our risk awareness paired with data science is really how enterprises are going to be able to start using this technology with confidence. And it's funny because it's leapfrogging privacy as a concern, in the sense that privacy was another area where we have compliance obligations. Cyber professionals, of course, always wanted to classify the data, protect the data, but it's gotten so complex, it's hard to navigate some of these systems without the help of the data scientists and the data engineers who are building out these technologies. And then whipping past privacy now are LLMs and AI that we're also going to have to constrain and manage.
So,
Well, there's also explainability that, sorry, forgive me, I'll just put this little tidbit in. There's also an old science, because I would say it's 30, 40 years old. It's called AI explainability. And that becomes a industry unto itself. So we have an LLM. We want to find out, how the heck did you come up with this? How did you come up with these particular results? So you go through the voluminous amounts of training, supervised training, and then you would be able to break it down into this voluminous explanation of how it was derived. Well, that's the problem with our little species, is that we don't have the time on Earth to go through that huge mountain of explainability. So the capsulization, and a rational, sane capsulization of that, is the next giant hurdle to overcome. And there's been some promising models for that, to allow us to go, all right, great, take this, Google bite of information, squish it down into some bullet points for me so I can get just the gist of it, and then, okay, I understand what you're thinking now. Now stop doing that, or do more of that, whatever it is. I'm sorry,
Totally.
Rupa, go ahead.
No worries. There were 2 points which I wanted to mention. One of them you covered already, in terms of the lack of data provenance is what is killing us, right? So you don't know where the data is coming from, because if you look at it, a lot of these learning models are training on data that already exists today, or what people are curating, right? There's nothing stopping us from going and searching on the web, right? Or searching on any specific site, whether it's a Glassdoor, whether it's a Reddit, whether it's another source, or like something like a Google or a Bing, or what have you, right? They give you the results, but when you see the results, what you also have are the sources that they're coming from, and you get to decide which ones you trust and which ones you don't. Now, when the LLM is creating this result, this huge story, it's a beautiful story for you, it's very difficult to tease out fact from fiction, right? Now, so it's all encapsulated in this beautiful message, and unless you spend another hour parsing out like where these things came from and what happened, this could be misleading. That's one part of it, right? And then we talk about poisoning, where once poison is set in, how do you clean it out? Yes, you can remove things immediately, but how long will they stay? I mean, maybe for the next 3 months, for the next 6 months, this thing will be the top trend. It's will be in the news everywhere. Everyone will know to ignore it, get deleted, whatever. But a year from now, what's stopping it from getting repeated and re-injected into the learning models, into the learnings, right? Or the rankings or the ratings or what have you, and coming back on a periodic basis. So unless we agree, deliberately make an effort, deliberately agree that these learning models, that's crowdsourced information. We need a way to tease apart and rate and rank and trust and set some sort of standardization around it. Outside of that, it's always going to be a whole pile of information there, but you need to take it with a grain of salt or a sack of salt, and then like somehow desalinate it in order to make it useful for you. So that's where there's also this aspect of things like Worm GPT on like completely changing topics, right? I mean, it's like the bad actors have access to all of those tools as much as you do.
Yep.
So I see this
Right.
whole red team exercise that some of us do, having that additional vector of what can you do, bringing in the Gen AI component as another factor, right? What can I do in addition as part of my red teaming exercise where I have all of these tools in my back pocket? What more damage can I do when there is a threat, whenever a scenario is being evaluated? So I see a lot of opportunity there in terms of using it to really train and bring your SOC to the next level. But there's also that part about training and pruning and cleaning up the data, which is a larger initiative and which requires standardization.
Well, there's a difference that's occurring in the industry right now, which is called siloed LLMs and non-siloed LLMs. It's just like it sounds. So I'm a company. I don't want people poisoning my LLM. I create a LLM that has a siloed amount of spec manuals for my IoT interface. And I want those spec manuals to tell me, am I in the right ballpark for my IoT, for my interfaces? Do I have best practices going? Do I have, whatever the spec is actually going to describe? And that's a siloed. Nobody's talking to it. It's been trained only on those specifications. It's a subject matter expert, as it were, for that. Then the unsiloed is what we're trying to cattle shoot and guide into a form of sanity when it's the wild, wild west. Everybody's in, everybody can put stuff into it. How do you find sanity in that? And is it worth putting sanity into that, doing complementative sanity checks so that you can add by subtracting and go, this is real, and all that other stuff over there is not real,
Yeah, I think one of the things that people miss when they first start interacting with this is if you go interact with ChatGPT for the first time, you feel like you're dealing with a super being. It knows everything, right? It knows the whole internet, but it doesn't, and that's not actually why it's important. It's important because these new large language models are the first time we have computer software that understands language in any meaningful way. Word processors didn't understand language, spell checkers didn't. But you now have things that speak English and speak Python and Java. And that's because we have this new architecture for dealing with this, and we can do it at a certain scale. And so what's magic about these foundation models is that you have things that can speak English or generate source code, but relying on them to know all the facts in the world, you're driving yourself down into a bad place. And I do see the strategies that people are gravitating to early, along the lines of the siloed thing, is, use a foundation model for the fact that somebody's given you this magic ability to have something that speaks English and French and Python. But if you're going to go after a certain market where you're going to provide security advice or medical advice or whatever, you've got to back that up with your own controlled facts, and you're going to have to do fine-tuning training or provide embeddings in a vector database or something else like that, where you're going to give it your curated knowledge. And that is going to be your massive differentiator and your moat. We've already started to see some of these early LLM companies get in trouble because they were nothing but sort of light wrappers on these large language models, where they just put a cool logo and a business model around a little bit of tuning on top of ChatGPT. Where you're going to see people building really durable value for their organizations is mating that up with their own unique perspective and their own unique data. And that's going to be really important from a value generation perspective. It's also going to be really important from a security perspective, because you're going to have some idea where that data came from. You can manage avoiding things like poisoning. You can control things like indirect prompt injection, where if your bot's running around reading the internet, you don't know what it's reading and you don't know what somebody's putting in. So it allows you to control the trust boundaries in your app. Using more traditional security language there, it allows you to control those trust boundaries in ways that these unfettered chatbots cannot.
I love that as a vision for the future, because one of the things that I've noticed over and over again is when you are trying to train detection technology, versus like train it in-house versus buy something provided by a third party, your own abuse patterns, if you train on your own abuse patterns, you're going to have a better functioning, performing model and detection system. And so I've always wished that the technology that we in cyber purchase, there was more flexibility in how we can train some of that really powerful machine learning that is embedded in those technologies, rather than rely in a lot of cases on the algorithms that are built outside of our own environments.
One thing I would touch on, part of the question that Deb asked was the ethics portion. So there's an interesting article or video that was put out that was talking about the United Kingdom having an experimentation where that they're doing facial recognition systems that actually catch shoplifters, people that are thieves in stores, and then other shop owners could take that information and use that to bar people from coming into their stores and stealing from them. Well, that's very lofty, very nice to do. However, what it did was it stepped outside the legal system. It tried and convicted the person, whether if there was an error in the visual recognition system. We know, I don't know if you all have a good understanding of it, but I'm just going to assume you do. One of the things is if you have a dark complexion, facial recognition systems, even currently today, have a problem with that because it has a edge calculation it has to go through to determine, is this person's nose this way or is their eyes that way, and it's being worked out now. But the problem is that this particular form of AI use tries and convicts and sentences the person outside of a legal system, and that's it. That's pretty much what it is. And what I'm seeing in use of large language models is some of the tendency of that being pulled into the LLM interactions, where that we ask a question. People have canonized AI into almost a god state. We're borrowing back from Isaac Asimov's famous work on foundations, where AI became a religion. So people are showing tendencies of that behavior now, where they're going, well, what about so and so? Well, I can't talk. Chatbot comes back, I can't talk about that, but I can just say this, and providing enough inference where you try, convict, and sentence somebody or some company or some particular product that's out there, and it's outside the legal system and outside the boundary, and the damage is done, and then you have to play catch up in the legal system to go, well, this is the amount of damage that I experienced, or this is the defamation that I've experienced from it. So in our rush to use these tools and to qualify siloed, unsiloed contaminations and so forth, the ethical boundaries have just recently been talked about. Now it's just like a henny penny thing. The sky's falling. What do we do? Well, there's great laws in place that will deal with it in the sense of defamation of character and interrupting business and so on and so forth. But more pointedly, what can we as AI contributors, add to that, so that we can actually say, of that, here's AI poisoning that's occurring in non-siloed systems. If you're going to do this non-siloed system, how are you going to put guardrails on that non-siloed system so it doesn't provide a perspective and biases under that perspective that's going to defame somebody or slander or libel somebody in this case where they're reading it, and then how do we address where that libel comes from? So explainability systems, going back to that for a second, explainability systems becomes a lot more valuable, even though it takes a gargantuan amount of resources to do. So just get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm sort of surprised to hear that folks are playing with deploying AI in that sort of soup to nuts in the justice system. I think a couple of years back, we'd already started experiencing some problems associated with predictive policing. um, and we've seen lots of cases where things like machine learning don't work. Fun fact, though, little historical fact, is that facial recognition and using that in sort of an anti-fraud or security context was actually, I think, piloted by casinos who had actually incorporated in the technology in order to find their high rollers. It was actually a marketing effort, but then they realized they could also maybe find folks who were cheating or counting cards, and they actually were able to circulate that information across casinos, which was an evolution from the book they used to circulate. So, fun historical fact. Another, maybe not as fun, but relevant historical fact is the role that folks who create these algorithms have always had in order to flush bias out of these systems. So, in financial services, the Fair Credit Reporting Act allows for sort of predictive analytics and understanding the creditworthiness of folks, but there's some data that you can't incorporate into those decisions because it violates the FCRA. And so I expect as we sort of build out some of these capabilities, we're going to face bias as something that we want to make sure that we understand and constrain. Privacy and bias are already two areas where folks who are building these technologies need to be thoughtful in how they train and deploy the technology to avoid creating those bad outcomes. And so I think the exploration of ethics is going to start from those foundations and build out. But I think that example that you gave, Mike, of using this technology within the justice system is a good example of, it's not just about what the algorithm or the model says, it's what you do with it and how much you depend on it, and what the outcomes then are going to be.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to say is if you keep up with various threats, vulnerabilities, if you're really because when I worked at Red Seal, I did this little team where we would look at the latest threats and then how our product could help defend from it. And as you start going through these, what you see is, oh, wait, we saw this 3 months ago, or we saw this 6 months ago, something very similar. And a lot of times at the core, it's just the same, I'm just say eternal blue, but the same, it's kind of like that, the hackers will just take some old code and just sort of put a new thing around it. But with this generative AI, I'm really concerned about the coding, because now you don't have to be an experienced, coder. And so they can go out and, have this Python script or whatever. So that I'm concerned about that. So I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that.
I can start on that. I think. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
All right. So, problem of bad code has always been there, right? The way I see it, open source, I mean, it has always been there and it's very prevalent. So, whether it's OpenSSL, whether it's something else, another library, there's always been potential for security vulnerabilities or security exploits to be, or even Easter eggs to be sitting over there in some sort of code or not. However, I think that the new dimension that things like, say, a Copilot and so on bring in are the fact that they can help you customize your code and provide language-specific constructs to create basic templates and basic headers, support functions, and so on. So over there, I mean, there's the distinction between somebody else's open source versus your own code, which has just been helped by Copilot, just like goes away, it completely vanishes, right? So it's now you become the owner and you become the accountable person for this piece of code you haven't written that could very well be malicious, and you didn't know because you didn't think twice about it.
Yeah, I think that when you move into a world where you're getting more AI generated code, well, first off, it's not like we haven't had code generators of various types for decades, and people have been putting large swaths of generated code into their applications forever. But I think this is qualitatively different, that you're taking this very custom generated code and using it. I think there's a lot of people right now worried about some very abstract problems about intellectual property provenance, and do you own it, and is it copyrightable, and are you getting something someone else's owns? I just advise people, look, if you're going to get a Copilot-like thing, and there are many out there right now, get it from get it from an organization that's mature, that has deep pockets, that's going to indemnify you, that if you're paying them to generate code on your behalf, that if something funky gets in there, that they're going to take care of it. If they wind up giving you somebody else's copyrighted code, that they're going to take care of that. And so I do suggest that, but I think you do have to treat it basically as a supply chain problem, and you treat some of this like you treat your open source code. You assume, just like everything, that it's unsafe, and there are very traditional application security practices that you could and should be applying to that generated code, just like anything that your intern wrote. And frankly, you're probably going to get better code out of the LLM than you are out of a first-year intern. So I think the risks there can be overblown. I think there are these very specific instances of things like package hallucination that are novel, but people have been typo squatting on things like that. It's not materially different, but it is a good example of, again, sort of over-reliance on these things without some kind of checking on it. The fact that the code was generated by a machine is not a reason you don't need AppSec tools. It's a reason that you do, and you should probably double down and make sure that your house is in order.
Yeah, I think the other part of it, the silver lining there, though, is that if you're using Gen AI powered AppSec tooling, right, then the minute the vulnerability is exposed, right? So assuming someone found injected a very interesting gem in Rails, in the Rails framework or so, right? The moment it gets identified or comes to light, at least the hope is that more and more people will see the resolutions or the remediations get pushed to them, as long as they're adopting these Gen AI solutions for security. So that's why I always think it's a double-edged sword. It could always come in handy, just as long as you're doing your due diligence. You can't do one without the other. You can't use Gen AI without doing security, and then use it wisely.
Yeah.
One thing I'm seeing is and it's an evangelistic point that I've been singing for a while now, is I took a large swath of the generative code generators all the way back to the first ones, which were developed around the late 60s, early 70s, and went forward and looked at them. And one thing that gets left out is to complementate or to titrate what you have put out in code. How do you do that? First off, you redefine what we call test-driven development, behavior-driven development. In test-driven development, you say, I have an idea, and that idea, when something occurs, where it occurs, how it occurs, and you define it out. And then there's a code generator that generates the seed code for you that fails, and your mission is to bring that seed code so it succeeds, because it's following what you described of that. That's been around for 30 years plus. But when we come to today's stuff, the co-pilots and the code whisperer and Bard and there's very little talk of using a complementative AI, which is adding by subtracting. Or it's a glorified term I love to use, but it really means a critic, an AI critic, that will come back and look at the code and go, this is BS right here. You said this, and this doesn't fit it, and this is why. Here's the holes that it's poking in it. So we take up the charge that the people who are trying to hang on to their 6-month, 9-month, 12-month development cycles, and having those taken away, so it's like a 2 or 3 day development cycle. One thing they are right about is that they need to have a sanity check of that code. Does it do what you say it is? All right, fine. So where's the proof of that? One of the tools I use is called Codium, Codeium. And what it does is it goes through and it not only documents what you just put in code, but it also takes comments that you put into a comment block and or a signature of a function or a class that you want to build, and it fleshes it out. And then it provides a host of tests to go against that to say, all right, are you on the right path of what you want? Or are you getting the data back in a way that doesn't make sense to you? And you need to rethink the question. You need to rethink the prompt. And by doing that, it cuts down the amount of time I'll be very conservative. About 45% of the time gets cut down in your code cycle for development. And if you follow that type of, all right, flesh out what you think the feature is going to be, try to describe a functional representation of it, whether it's just a word description so the LLM can understand it, or it's a signature, which is a class or a function definition with the variables you think are going to go into that. It generates it. It does the test generation. It does the documentation simultaneously. And then see is this really meets up with what your users want to use for, not your users, but your investors, your clients want to have for their ultimate scope of information. And that gets you within the ballpark of what you really want to do. So especially in AI code generation for the military, especially for them, which I've done a large amount of with, is that we went back and we saved a lot of time by doing it this way. And it caused us to not totally eliminate the hallucinatory stuff, because there's a certain amount of our own delusions that get in the way of everything we do. So we're kind of like sorting out our own head at the same time we're trying to say, yes, I am the customer and I want X, Y, Z to do this, and that, And so it's one thing to chew on, one thing to consider.
So, okay, now I'm going to do the next question. So what skills and knowledge will cybersecurity professionals need to navigate the AI-driven cybersecurity landscape, and how can their companies support them? And I'll start out by saying Coursera.org's got some great, I found a really good one on there for Google's got a really good generative AI. So I know everybody on here, you're all like really deep ML AI. I myself, I am, constantly learning. And so I'm like, okay. But so I'll start out with that. But yeah, so what else do you recommend?
So I'll start off. I'll come at it from a little different angle, which is I don't think it's as important to list off a set of skills that people need to go acquire. It's going to be, there's so much out there to learn. I would say the most important thing is if you're coming relatively new to this, and even if you were an AI expert 3 years ago, the world's very different than it was 3 years ago. So I would come to this with an open mind. I would be experimenting with the different technologies out there, even if they don't seem like the thing that's directly applicable to what you're doing. Why would a security expert go play with Midjourney? Because, image generation is going to become core to fraud and phishing and everything else. And so going out and playing around broadly with these generative AI technologies, understanding what they can and can't do today and what direction they're going, it's probably way more important than understanding the transformer architecture sitting under this new class of neural networks. Just really get your hands wet with all these different tools that are coming out.
I'd say also in addition to that, networking, right? Or understanding what others in your others in the industry are doing, and sharing information. And that's the only way we get better at it. In terms of there's one angle in terms of going deep into the AI tech itself, but there's data scientists doing that, right? I mean, knowing the overall tech is important, but how it can be used better or how it could be misused is what the focus of security professionals should be. I mean, that's where they could bring the most value, right? We have all of these learnings in terms of what are the top risks, what are the vulnerabilities. We know what the security threat landscape is overall, but how can these technologies that are coming up be used for better or worse is what is important to understand. And one person cannot do it all. So shared learning and participating in things like B-Sides or the OWASP conferences, those could be one aspect. Also just networking, pure networking, I think comes in very useful.
Well, I love a good Coursera class. And I think that kind of goes to what I was thinking in my head before Steve started speaking was, I think it's fine to dabble in a lot of these things, just sort of play with them, just like most cybersecurity professionals, not most of them, but many cybersecurity professionals play with attacker tools. Maybe they're an AppSec person, but they want to play with some risk analysis tools or network security tools. So I think that it's important. It's going to be important, continue to be important for cybersecurity professionals to understand the sort of foundations of what's being protected. Your data environment, the software that's running on your systems, how your network is configured and such, and then these AI-enabled bits or pieces or tools are probably going to be running in the context of an environment you're also supposed to be protecting. So I think when it comes to what are the foundational things folks need, it is sort of revisiting the foundations, but then also experimenting and playing with new technologies as they come through.
I think in martial arts, the most dangerous person in the martial arts school is the white belt. Is the person who doesn't know what they don't know. And a passionate curiosity is one thing that we can't stifle and we have to encourage in the workplace. Also, since we've all touched on this, which is the humanization of technology, so that the average person who doesn't have a deep data science background, who doesn't have a deep security background, they can go, point out something like that white belt, that the quote unquote experts are not looking at, they're not seeing, because the experts are maybe clouded with a whole bunch of different biases that are preventing them from considering it. So I think, going back to what Steve said, what's happened recently, what took place recently? Well, what took place recently is a more humanization of the technology. What can happen when we put that paintbrush into the average person and see what can actually happen in that area? And then go, oh, by the way, there's cybersecurity that you were really curious about, or there's data science you're curious about, or behavioralistic sciences that you might be wanting to look at. And then just let them go as deep as they possibly want to go and organically grow in those particular areas. And I've long dealt with people with, tons of sheepskin, and they couldn't see the tree for the forest, or vice versa. I mean, they were myopic, and they couldn't get around themselves, and they couldn't let themselves just unleash and start painting and start creating something they've never seen before. So that's the main thing I would say we really need to have in today's world, is we need to have the passionate artist take a hold of this paintbrush and really just go nuts. Just really have a blast with it. And it reminds me, this is me being an old hippie, reminds me of the hippie days, where it's like, we didn't know what we didn't know, and we started creating phenomenal music, and we started creating phenomenal art, and we started a generation that did things that just blew our own socks off. And we need to get back to that, because the world is, to sound a little preachy here, the world's in dire need of miracles, and they're dire need of creative unleashing again. At least that's my opinion of it. But a good foundation in mathematics, which is my love, that couldn't hurt.
Yeah, so based like on what Allison was saying, of course, back to the basics, understanding your network, understanding your data. I mean, that's always like the basic. A lot of people are like, I want to get into cybersecurity. Well, you know what? Taking that networking job actually is going to build your skills for cybersecurity. So don't turn down, just a networking job. And by the way, go check out Bard, go check out ChatGPT. If you haven't been on it, try it out, see what's going on. And this other mid journey, is that what you said, Steve?
Yep.
And other, yeah. And so, because one of the things I am excited about AI is that it's a way to where you don't have to do some of these mundane tasks and you can be more creative. So, that's one thing that I'm really excited about it. And that the average person can go out there and, talk to the AI and get, answers and things like that. So, but I wanted to say thank you, everyone. This was such an awesome panel. This is so great. And till next time.
Been a pleasure.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah.
Have
Thanks
a great
so
week.
much.
Thank you
Have
again.
a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.